back. WNST, Towson, Baltimore, and WNST.net. So many stories sports-wise here as we go into sort of a quiet period, I would think, here locally on the backside of the Ravens. Who knows what the Orioles are going to be up to in the coming weeks, or what the fallout of Mike Elias and Sig Mejdal and the Astros. Managers are falling all over the place, Luke Jones, but I'm not here to talk about the past or even baseball with you. We can do that next week when we're at the Super Bowl as we discuss what happened to Lamar Jackson and the Ravens. We're going to move down to Miami. We're going to do Super Bowl coverage. We're going to talk about Terrell Suggs being in the Super Bowl. But in the meantime, the Ravens are paddling underwater, and Eric DeCosta getting ready for a draft and free agency and which players to sign and how much for Matt Judon, amongst other things. And John Harbaugh had his sort of graduation press conference on Friday, moving from one season into another. The Combine's around the corner. There's all sorts of questions. I don't know if Steve Bisciotti sits in front of us anymore. Apparently they've, new president, we take all sorts of things away. I don't know whether we're going to hear from Steve Bisciotti or whether we're going to hear from Eric DeCosta or whom we're going to hear from. But we did hear from John Harbaugh. I don't know if it was particularly somber on Friday. I was with Governor O'Malley. You can check that stuff out at Baltimore Positive next week. But I don't know what's to be said when you lose a game the way they lost the game. Like, it wasn't a field goal. It was one of those games we're going to be trying to explain for a long, long time. And I think John Harbaugh is, until such point with Lamar Jackson, his image is on the fat head behind us at a Super Bowl instead of Patrick Mahomes, which is where we're going to be next week. We're going to talk about what the hell happened to the Tennessee Titans on that Saturday night in January.
I think you have to. When you're talking about a team that won 12 in a row and was 14-2, and from an analytics standpoint and all these different measurements, look like maybe the most impressive team the NFL had seen in the regular season since the Patriots a decade ago. I mean, that's how good it all was. That's how impressive and promising it all was. And then it just came to a stop. It ends that abruptly. It always does, short of making it to the Super Bowl. I mean, it ends that quickly for you. And you're left to look at it and ask what happened. And John Harbaugh on Friday, I thought he handled questions well. I thought he was very cordial with the media. But if you were expecting, waiting, hoping, demanding for him to throw Greg Roman under the bus or throw his run defense under the bus or whatever that went wrong that you felt went wrong on Saturday, and in most cases, the answer is yes. If you ask about a certain phase that went wrong for the Ravens against the Titans in the divisional round, that you're right. I mean, it was multiple things, but John Harbaugh meeting with the media 6 days after it happened, a little more measured, a little more, I think he was still somber. I think he was still very disappointed. It's not as though Harbaugh was cavalier about things, but he certainly was more measured and had some perspective, and he acknowledged that the Ravens, quote, didn't play our game, but at the same time, he wasn't going to say, well, Greg Roman really got away from the run game, which I think you can still look at the numbers and look at how it's skewed and kind of debate just how much they actually did get away from the run, but it's clear they were out of sync. It was clear that they didn't play their style of football, and as a result, and a major credit to the Tennessee Titans for their major part in it, they're going home, and they're looking forward now to the off season. And I think the good thing is there isn't a ton of work to be done, but there's certainly work to be done, I think more specifically on the defensive side of the ball, and we'll get into all that, and there's plenty to talk about, plenty to feel really encouraged by, but as you said it, and I agree, the next step is there. Anything short of the Ravens getting to the Super Bowl next year, it's going to feel disappointing. I mean, it felt disappointing this year because of the expectations that they created.
Yeah, they can't open the season 1-3 next year.
Yeah, I mean, anything short of the Super Bowl next year is going to feel like a failure. And I can't – I mean, you always have to take the circumstances as they come. If Lamar Jackson sprains his ankle and misses a month and the Ravens go 1-3 with RG3 or Trace McSorley, whoever the backup is, and that whole thing, and then as a result, you're a wild card on the road compared to being a division winner and maybe having a first-round bye, who knows? You always reevaluate as you go along, but this team, as it stands right now, it's Super Bowl or bust, and that's the expectation that's been created, not just this year, but even going back to what they did in the second half of 2018. And if Lamar Jackson's not up on the wall, as you mentioned, when they're playing in Tampa next year for the Super Bowl, when we're down there on Radio Row, then it's going to be a disappointment. And I think the Ravens are okay with that understanding, with that expectation. I mean, it's why they do this. Ultimately, you want to be the last team that's standing, the team that won its last game in early February. We know it's very difficult to do. I think last weekend was a good reminder that there's no entitlement or birthright or anything like that. I mean, as confident as fans, media, and the team was in this team's ability to get to a Super Bowl, they fell short, and they fell short because they didn't play well, and they got beat, and they got beat pretty soundly. So everything they now do over the next 12 months, everything from free agent signings to draft to OTAs, mini camp, training camp, preseason, regular season, all of that, it's all going to point to one thing: how does this impact their ability to win a Super Bowl? And until next January, assuming everything goes as scheduled, goes as planned, and they're back in the tournament, it's all going to come back to how do they do in January. And I think that's what's a challenge for this team. I think that's something that they'll embrace, though. So it's Super Bowl or bust. I mean, it's one thing to talk about being young or you're a year away in competitive window, but I think the San Francisco 49ers doing what they did after the season they had in 2018, that's a reminder that you can talk about being on schedule and window and all that. That's why the loss to the Titans was so disappointing, because you just don't know if you're going to be back in a position 14-2 and number one seed. Even if the team's better next year, it's still really tough to go 14-2, even if you're a great team. So I think that's both the challenge, but I think the Ravens will also view that as a great opportunity here over the next 12 months, but they have a lot of work to do.
He is Luke Jones. He is Baltimore Luke, and Luke at WNST.net. We will be heading south to Miami, even if the Ravens aren't. Chiefs will be there. The 49ers will be there. Terrell Suggs will be there. You talk about off seasons. I mean, Terrell Suggs wasn't supposed to be anywhere but with the Ravens last March, this time last year, if he was going to play. Now he's on his third team, right? So it really is amazing how these off seasons and how we sort of chart it and how we talk about it and how we measure expectations. Expectations were through the roof for Patrick Mahomes, right? And middle of the season, it didn't look so good for the Chiefs, and here they are, right? So it's part of this. The story never goes only in one direction, right? I mean, there's ups and there's downs. That's part of all of this. Hey, Aaron Rodgers is feeling it today. The Tennessee Titans were on a magic carpet ride until they weren't anymore. They got their feelings hurt this week as well. The Ravens just sort of had it a week earlier, but dude, next week in Miami, everyone that sits next to us isn't going to want to talk about the Patrick Mahomes fathead on my one side or the Jimmy Garoppolo fathead on the other side or Buckner or Bosa or whoever it will be. They're going to want to talk to us about Lamar Jackson and what went wrong. So, we're at the beginning of this, and I know you and I did not do the boohoo cry thing all last week because I feel like we're going to be doing that for the next 30 weeks. Like literally the next 30 weeks. Every person we come into contact with, football related, is going to go to Lamar and what happened and how can it not happen again. And it can only happen again next January, right? You have to sort of pound sand on this for the next 50 weeks.
Yeah, and it's not just Lamar. I mean, it's this entire football team. I think you got to throw John Harbaugh in there. I mean, John Harbaugh's won one playoff game since Super Bowl 47. Not saying I'm ready to fire him or anything crazy like that, but the reputation that this organization had built through the first 6 or 7 years under John Harbaugh, they were known for what? Every year they got in the playoffs, they won at least one playoff game. Well, now they've gone 2 years in a row where they've lost a home playoff game, their first shot at it. So there is a challenge there that anything they do, when you have this kind of a record-setting season, all the franchise records, first team in NFL history to average 200 passing yards, 200 rushing yards in a game. They set the all-time single-season rushing record. You do all of those things, and then you don't win a playoff game. What are you going to do in the regular season? I mean, you said 30 weeks or 40 weeks. We're going to be talking about this for the next 52 weeks. It's going to be until they're playing again in January that everything they do will always come with the naysayer saying, well, what about January? And the Ravens really can't say anything to argue that, right? I mean, the reputation, I mean, it's what Marlon Humphrey said. I mean, the reputation, it's a harsh way of putting it, but their reputation right now is great regular season team that chokes in January. And this generation of Ravens players, when you consider how few are left from the Super Bowl 47 team, I mean, there aren't many left from the 2014 team, the last team that won a playoff game here in Baltimore. There aren't many guys left. So this new generation of players, while by no means anyone, people shouldn't be writing them off for anything silly like that, but until they break through, the questions are going to be there. And we can talk about the Ravens going 12-4 or 13-3 or 14-2. Heck, they could go 15-1 next regular season. We'd still be asking, okay, what's going to happen in January? Are they going to break through? Is this going to be the year that they get back to a Super Bowl? Is this going to be the year we're seeing Lamar Jackson up on the wall? Is this going to be what really fully validates John Harbaugh's second act here in Baltimore to get the Ravens back to a Super Bowl? And none of those questions are going to be answered until the Ravens are kicking it off in mid-January. So,
well, they're also drafting 28th. They have a lot of draft picks. They generally wind up with a whole bunch of these Mark Andrews, Orlando Brown types in the 3rd and 4th and 5th round that wind up out-kicking their coverage. That is
sure.
that is sort of their market advantage in having done this for as long as they've done it. And now they've loaded up on picks a la the Belichick method to say we're going to take more of those kinds of picks. I don't even look at this team and say, where is this glaring weakness that they have? You could say, well, they're going to have to draft a linebacker, the D-line, and stopping the run because that's what ultimately was their downfall, in the same way when Tom Brady would throw the ball over their head 5 years ago that they had to go and draft, every Terrence Brooks that they could find, or Matt Elam they could find, or Jimmy Smith they could find at that time. I don't have any specific direction. I mean, for crying out loud, they were 14-2, right?
Right.
I mean, I don't know that I'm going to look at them and say, oh, my God, the linebacking core is this or that. And knowing that the cap space they have, the quality of players that are going to be out in the marketplace, the amount of draft picks they have, the money coming off the books, the salaries they could edge out, maybe losing a Marshall Yanda to retirement, who knows. There are going to be changes here, but I don't feel like we're in the do they know what they're doing stage like we are with, let's say, the Orioles at this point. You're like, we know they know what they're doing. This is really more about Lamar and John and the components of this showing next year they can be as good as they were this year at various points to give themselves a chance to play playoff games in January next year where they show up with a more inspired effort.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with that. I mean, I can't remember. I may have made the comment to you last week in one of our conversations, but this team, as it's currently constructed, they could lose virtually every free agent that they have and just, say, have an average draft. Not a terrible draft, but just have kind of a typical middle-of-the-pack kind of draft. And as they're currently constructed, with Lamar Jackson and this offense being as young as it is and having as many people coming back as they do, with the secondary that they have, with the special teams, obviously the kicking game that they have. And, okay, maybe if they didn't do anything in terms of free agency, anything of real significance, and you kind of just rolled it back out there very similar to what it was this year, just with some free agents departed, maybe they wouldn't be the favorite, but I'd still look at that as a playoff caliber team right there. So that speaks to this kind of spot that they're in right now. I mean, They have, the way it's looking, looks like their coaching staff is going to be back. I mean, there was talk of James Urban and Bobby Ingram. They both interviewed with Philadelphia for some job openings there, but they're staying put. We know Greg Roman and Wink Martindale didn't get a head coaching opportunity. So, I mean, the coaching staff's back intact. I think we could certainly talk about the front seven. I mean, they're going to have to do some work there. There's no question about that. But everything you talk about is an opportunity to get even better. I mean, this isn't a broken football team. Just because they lost against Tennessee, and just because that was really, really disappointing, and it's okay to be really disappointed, and to view that as a failure on some level, not that the whole season was a failure, but certainly January was a failure, it's fine to feel that way, but even feeling that way, you still have to look at this thing and remind yourself, they went 14-2. We're not talking about major surgery that this team has to undergo and to make themselves into a contender. They're already a contender. Goes back to what I've said at a couple points, and I'll continue to say this. One of the big keys is going to be, can this team improve in its ability to play off schedule? What I mean by that is exactly what happened to the Ravens offense against Tennessee. They fell behind by 2 scores. Okay, I know people say, well, they got too far away from the running game, and I'll hear that, and I'm not going to argue with that. But when they're in a position where they have to open things up a little more from a passing standpoint, can Lamar Jackson take another step forward? I mean, he took, 4 or 5 steps forward this year. Can he take another step or 2 forward in that way? And I think it's fair to think that he can.
Well, and I think he's also pissed off for greatness at this point. I mean, no one is going to, I mean, for all the pride and all the ESPYs and all the whatever and the awards he's going to win, man, he's not going to want to talk about last Saturday night. And he's going to talk about it a lot because that was his nature last year to sort of bring it up. And this was way more public, way more disappointing, way more what happened, way more you let Ryan Tannehill play on Sunday against Mahomes out in Kansas City instead of here. It's going to eat at this kid. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah, and I mean, and let's be clear about this. How he played against the Titans, so not even close to what happened against the Chargers through the first 3 quarters. I mean, he didn't play his best game by any means, but there were also 7 drops, and the offensive line didn't play well, and we've talked about the defense. I mean, that was much more of a full-blown collective team loss against the Titans than what we saw against the Chargers.
But I know that, you know that, but he's going to wear
it. But
it's
going to eat at him. There's no question about that. And I think it's going to eat at all of them because of the collective nature of that loss. But to get back to what I was saying, I mean, can they play a little more off schedule, open things up a little bit more? I think another wide receiver would certainly help in that process. Certainly Lamar continuing to develop, which I think there's more development to be made there.
Well, not having the coaches rated was also like a really, really big part of this. Yeah.
No question. So you have all those elements on the offensive side, and then on the defensive side, as much as they rely on the secondary, as much as they rely on the blitz, can you fortify that front seven? Can you find a linebacker that's a 3-down guy for you? You know, Josh Bynes and L.J. Fort and Patrick Owasso and and Chuck Clark dropping into the box and Anthony Levine being a dime back. I mean, they really, it worked.
Small backer by committee, right?
Yeah, it worked, but ideally, can you find, not the next Ray Lewis, because you're not going to have that, but can you find a guy that is closer to being at least your next C.J. Mosley that can be a 3-down linebacker for you and give you a little more flexibility there? I mean, I think the Ravens were so versatile, so multiple with their defense. They ran so much dime. I think that was a big reason why they struggled to stop the run at times. Not that it was like this chronic issue they had every week, but I think because they relied so much on their sub packages and relied so much on nickel and dime that when you're in a situation like they were against San Francisco in early December, certainly against the Titans, where you're in this closer game or you're trailing, that suddenly you're playing a style, you're having to play a style of defense that you're not really as comfortable with. You're not as adept at playing with your base package. As silly as that sounds, I mean, we have to stop calling a 3-4 or a 4-3 a base package now because teams, they don't run it very often because you're always in sub because of how much this is a passing league. But I think the Ravens, part of it's contractual because Judon and some of those other guys I mentioned are going to be free agents, and Michael Pierce up front. So they're going to have to address the front seven anyway, but can they get a little beefier up front? Can they get a little more consistent up front to the point where you're not having to sub in and out two different guys at the second level every single play? Because I think there's a reason why those guys aren't on the field every single play. And look, it's great to have flexibility and to have multiple looks, but what happens when you get caught with the wrong look on the field against the wrong offense or the wrong play call? You'll have Derrick Henry, bust one, or you'll have Raheem Mostert bust one. I mean, we saw it, and wasn't a terrible run defense, but it wasn't a Ravens run defense. I mean, they gave up 4.4 yards per carry. They were 21st in the NFL in yards per carry allowed. That's very un-Raven-like. So they have some things they have to work on both sides of the ball, but getting it back to what you said a few minutes ago, this is not a team that needs to look at what happened against the Titans and start making drastic changes. I don't want to see John Harbaugh become conservative again on 4th and 1 because they got stopped twice. That was part of their identity this year was to succeed on 4th downs, and it completely changed your play calling, and it changed your ability to control the clock. And I don't want to see the Ravens go away from that. That was really good process. You can't let results completely change your process. If you believe in your process, hey, every once in a while you're going to bust when you have a 12 at the blackjack table. I mean, that's just the reality. That's going to happen. But I think for the Ravens, it's marrying that understanding with what they do need to do to tweak and adjust in the off season to put themselves in a position that, okay, maybe they're not 14-2, maybe it's 11-5 or 12-4 next year, but have themselves in a position to then break through in January. So it's going to be challenging, but the good thing is they have the resources to attack that. They have the ability and cap space and draft picks to make some tweaks and make some changes and some additions here and there. And this isn't something that, like I said, it doesn't need major surgery when you're 14-2. As much as it hurts right now for Ravens fans, we're talking about tweaks here. We're talking about slight adjustments here. We're talking about an opportunity to bring in a player at a position that isn't necessarily a weakness, but a position that could become more of a strength. And that's a good place to be. And that's where, as ticked off as you still might be about that, and I understand that, and look, it's a bad loss, and it was really disappointing, and you should be ticked off about that. Still have the perspective to say this was a really special season with a team that we thought was going to be very special. Turned out not to be in January, but there's still a lot there to really, really like. And now it's going to be Eric DaCosta and Ozzie Newsome and the scouting department and John Harbaugh and his coaching staff. It's going to be their job, along with the players, to make improvements and to make tweaks and come up with new ideas. And Harbaugh loves to say, you're either getting better or you're getting worse. I think the Ravens, you hope and you would expect and anticipate that they have that kind of growth mindset to say, hey, all right, we had a great regular season. Playoffs stunk. That ticks us off, but let's use that as
all
motivation.
All 4 quarters
now.
stunk, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, let's use that as motivation now over the next few months in the off season, and then when we're back at the facility in the spring and getting into training camp, let's use that as motivation to get better and to tweak and to take this revolutionary Ravens offense and now bring out version 2 or version 3 maybe we're on at this point. So I think there's plenty there to still be very optimistic about, even with some of that disappointment that still hasn't worn off. And I can't blame any fans for that because, hey, 14-2 and number 1 seed, the Ravens let a really huge opportunity slip through their fingers. But the good news is, unlike a lot of teams where you're talking about older teams or teams that are really up against the cap, the situation, the circumstances are there for this team to make another really, really good run at it here over the next couple of years. And now you just hope that you make the good decisions, and you have some good luck along the way, and hey, how about winning a playoff game next January? Start with that.
Yeah, let's do that. He is Luke Jones. He is resting comfortably, toweling off. He's trying to steal the signs of the Houston Astros to get even with them. That's something, huh? You and I are going to talk about that just a little bit, right?
Yeah, well, I'm sure we'll be talking about that just a smidge here over the next year. I mean, it's funny because not to get too far into this because I know we'll talk about it plenty, but people talk so much, and baseball is my first love. It's my favorite sport. I don't shy away from that. But people talk so much about
it was my first love. It's not my current love, and I don't shy away from that.
Yeah, and that's fine. And
there's a lot more people like me than like you at this point, apparently. So,
but people talk about the integrity of the game, but I also think about the fact that I'm 36 years old, and I think about the back end of the '81 strike. That was a little bit before my time, but you had cocaine in the '80s, and you had the owners conspiring, and you had that with free agency. You had Pete Rose. You had the PED era. I mean, you have this now.
No, you have the Hall of Fame debates about the PE era.
Yes, I mean, so I think about that. I mean, I just fired off 5, 6, 7 different scandals of varying degrees. And that's just over my 36 years here on Earth as a baseball fan. So, look, I think at the end of the day, we have to, and I think most of us are good about this, but we have to not look at the sports, the sporting realm as being our moral compass, because all sports have these kind of scandals.
What did Charles Barkley say? I ain't your role model, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's, it was funny. I said in a previous segment, I was helping my sister and brother-in-law move on Sunday, and I was listening to some national radio pregame for the conference championship games. And what were the hosts talking about? They were talking about the latest, the Netflix documentary on Aaron Hernandez. And I'm thinking, okay, look, I'm not going to excuse the Astros or the Red Sox or any of this. I mean, it's embarrassing for the sport, yet I'm listening to a pregame show for the AFC Championship game, and they're talking about a guy who recently, we're not talking about a long time ago, recently played in the NFL, who was a murderer, and they're talking about this, and I'm just thinking every sport has this kind of stuff. It's not to forgive it. It's not to say it's okay, but it's a reminder that at the end of the day, this stuff is entertainment, and if we're looking for our moral compass to be baseball or football or, look, we can find certain athletes here and there to feel good about, and that's great, and there certainly are athletes to feel really good about, but, these sports are just as flawed as every other realm of society in this day and age, and we'll get into it more specifically. But that's my that's my thumbnail assessment of the situation.
He's Luke Jones. You can thumbnail along with him out on Twitter at Baltimore Luke. You can find me out in the buyatoyota.com audio vault. We're getting political around here because it's important. Mayor's race is up on April 28th. You're going to hear from mayoral candidates through Vignaraja, as well as current mayor Jack Young, mayor candidates Brandon Scott, as well as TJ Smith. We're going to hear from Mary Washington and Mary Miller coming up soon on Baltimore Positive when I get back. And this week, most importantly, the 7th Congressional District vacated by the loss of Elijah Cummings. We're going to hear from 6 candidates. Check all that out at Baltimore Positive, as well as Martin O'Malley, who wrote a book on smarter government. We took a deep dive with him. You'll only hear that on the radio this week. It will debut on Baltimore Positive next week. Luke and I will be at Super Bowl 54 all next week with Hall of Famers, celebrities, dignitaries, rock stars, friends. Next week will be amazing. It always is. It's the week we sort of muscle up and show the FM competitors who's daddy around here. So make sure you're checking that out. We'll be in South Beach all next week. You can always find me out in the buyatoyota.com audio vault. I am Nestor. We are WNST.net, AM 1570, and WNST Towson, Baltimore, and we never stop talking Baltimore sports.